Good evening and welcome to the Public Forum. Tonight we delve into a question that stands at the crossroads of public health and personal freedom. Specifically, we are asking, should the government have the authority to mandate vaccination for all its citizens? To explore this complex issue, we have two distinguished guests. Arguing in favor of mandatory vaccination is Dr. Alex Kirby, a respected public health specialist with decades of experience in epidemiology. And arguing against such mandates is Ms. Lena Hansen, a prominent ethicist and advocate for civil liberties. Each will begin with an opening statement, followed by rebuttals and a cross-examination period, before concluding with their final remarks.
Thank you, Sarah. I contend that government-mandated vaccination is not only justifiable, but an essential measure for ensuring the health and safety of the entire population. My primary argument rests on the well-established principle of herd immunity, or community immunity. When a high percentage of the population is vaccinated, the spread of contagious diseases is significantly curtailed. This collective immunity is paramount for protecting those who cannot be vaccinated due to legitimate medical reasons, such as individuals with compromised immune systems, young infants, or those with severe allergies to vaccine components. They rely on the vaccinated majority for their safety. Furthermore, the scientific consensus on the safety and efficacy of vaccines is overwhelming. Decades of rigorous research and real-world application have demonstrated their power. We have historical precedents. Diseases like smallpox have been eradicated, and polio drastically reduced, primarily through widespread, often mandated vaccination programs. These successes are not trivial. They represent millions of lives saved and immense suffering averted. Finally, I view vaccination as a civic duty, a core component of the social contract. In a society, individual actions invariably impact others. The minor inconvenience or the infinitesimally small risk associated with a thoroughly tested vaccine is significantly outweighed by the substantial benefit to collective well-being. Choosing to vaccinate is an act of societal obligation. Therefore, positioning mandatory vaccination as a proactive and responsible policy is crucial for the comprehensive protection of our society from preventable diseases.
Thank you, Sarah. While I appreciate Dr. Kirby's commitment to public health, I must firmly argue that government-mandated vaccination represents a profound and unacceptable infringement upon fundamental individual liberties, most notably bodily autonomy. The right of individuals to make decisions about their own bodies and medical treatments is a cornerstone of a free society. This principle of self-determination is paramount. Mandates inherently undermine the critical ethical requirement of informed consent. When the state compels a medical procedure, consent is no longer truly free. It is replaced by coercion, regardless of the purported benefits. Moreover, granting the government the power to mandate this specific medical intervention sets a deeply concerning precedent. It opens the door to potential government overreach, creating a, quote, slippery slope, where other personal healthcare decisions could eventually be dictated by the state, progressively eroding personal sovereignty. It's also crucial to acknowledge that all medical procedures, including vaccination, carry some level of risk, however small. These risks can vary between individuals based on their unique health profiles. Individuals must retain the freedom to assess these risks for themselves, in careful consultation with healthcare providers they trust, without government compulsion. A quote, 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 to quote, 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 months of individual health. Therefore, I advocate for public health strategies that champion education, transparency, easy access, and voluntary participation, rather than resorting to coercive measures that compromise our cherished liberties.
Ms. Hansen raises a valid point about bodily autonomy, and I agree it's a significant consideration. However, Individual autonomy is not an absolute right when its exercise poses a direct and preventable threat to the health and lives of others, particularly the most vulnerable in our communities. This isn't about minor inconveniences. It's about preventing the spread of serious, sometimes fatal, infectious diseases. Society often places limitations on individual freedoms for the greater good. Think of speed limits or smoking bans in public places. This is a comparable, quote, compelling state interest. Regarding government overreach, it's important to differentiate. Public health mandates aimed at preventing widespread epidemics are distinct from other types of government intervention into personal lives. We have historical precedents for such measures, like mandatory school vaccinations, which have proven immensely beneficial and widely accepted over time. My concern is that purely voluntary measures, while ideal in theory, often fall short of achieving the necessary vaccination rates for robust herd immunity. This leaves significant portions of the population, especially those who cannot be vaccinated, unnecessarily exposed to danger.
Dr. Kirby, while the concept of herd immunity is understood, I question whether it unequivocally justifies overriding fundamental human rights. Have we truly exhausted all non-coercive avenues, such as comprehensive public education campaigns, addressing misinformation effectively, and ensuring equitable, easy access to vaccines for all? You mentioned the social contract. I would argue that the terms of this contract, particularly in a democratic society, should not extend to forced medical procedures upon an unwilling populace. Such actions risk severely damaging the trust between citizens and the state, a trust that is vital for effective public health cooperation in the long term. Furthermore, by dismissing individual risk assessment, mandates ignore the reality that for some individuals, the perceived or actual risks of a vaccine, or specific concerns about novel vaccine technologies, might feel more significant than the risk of the disease itself, especially if they are young and healthy. A mandate effectively silences these legitimate personal considerations and can breed resentment rather than compliance. True public health success is built on trust and partnership, not compulsion.
We will now move to the cross-examination phase. Ms. Hansen, you have the first question for Dr. Kirby.
Dr. Kirby, you advocate for mandates. If a government compels vaccination and an individual, however rarely, suffers a severe adverse reaction directly attributable to that mandated vaccine, what specific responsibility does the state bear for that harm? And how does such a mandate reconcile with the fundamental medical ethics principle of primum non nocere, first, do no harm, on an individual level?
That's a critical question, Ms. Hansen. Most countries with robust vaccination programs, whether mandated or strongly encouraged, also have established no-fault compensation schemes. These are designed to provide support and financial redress to individuals who experience severe, proven adverse events following vaccination without the need to prove negligence. The statistical rarity of such events, while devastating for the individual, must be weighed against the far greater, statistically certain harm and loss of life that occurs when preventable diseases spread unchecked through an under-vaccinated population. The do no harm principle must also consider the harm of inaction to the wider community.
Following up on that, Dr. Kirby, how would a mandatory vaccination system effectively and fairly manage requests for exemptions, whether for clear medical contraindications, deeply held religious beliefs, or strong philosophical objections, without either creating loopholes that significantly undermine the mandate's public health goals, or, conversely, becoming overly restrictive and potentially discriminatory against certain groups?
For medical exemptions, the criteria must be clearly defined, based on scientific evidence, and assessed by qualified medical professionals. These would be for individuals with documented allergies to vaccine components or specific immune conditions, for instance. These are generally straightforward. Regarding religious or philosophical exemptions, this is admittedly more complex. However, in a declared public health emergency where community protection is paramount, The threshold for granting such non-medical exemptions would need to be exceptionally high, if permitted at all. The primary aim is to protect the collective, and widespread exemptions would indeed undermine that goal.
Thank you. Dr. Kirby, you may now question Ms. Hansen.
Ms. Hansen, you advocate for voluntary measures. If, despite best efforts in education and accessibility, voluntary vaccine uptake remains insufficient to achieve herd immunity, how then does a society ensure it adequately protects its most vulnerable members? Those who genuinely cannot be vaccinated, like cancer patients on chemotherapy or newborns, from preventable and potentially lethal infectious diseases.
Dr. Kirby, if voluntary uptake is insufficient, the first step isn't to immediately jump to coercion. It's to critically reevaluate why it's insufficient. Are there unaddressed fears? Is access truly equitable across all communities? Are we effectively countering misinformation with trusted messengers? We could intensify targeted support, engage community leaders, deploy mobile vaccination units to underserved areas, and invest far more heavily in transparent communication campaigns that build trust rather than dictate. Coercion should be the absolute last resort, if considered at all, not a default solution when initial voluntary efforts face challenges.
You place great emphasis on bodily autonomy. However, does that autonomy, in your view, extend to a right to potentially infect others with a serious communicable disease, especially those who have no choice in their exposure? In the context of highly contagious illnesses, where does individual liberty end and public health responsibility begin?
That is indeed one of the most complex ethical boundaries we face. Bodily autonomy is a foundational right, and diminishing it carries profound risks. It is important not to frame non-vaccination as a direct or malicious intent to harm others. People have varied reasons for their choices, including fear, lack of information, or prior negative experiences with the medical system. While public health is a vital concern, the solution, in my view, lies not in overriding these rights through state power, which can lead to a dangerous erosion of trust and liberty, but in fostering a culture of responsibility through means that respect individual conscience and choice. The line is difficult, but state compulsion in medical matters is a line I believe we should be exceptionally wary of crossing.
In closing, I want to reiterate that mandatory vaccination is not a punitive measure, but a scientifically proven, effective, and necessary tool for safeguarding public health. It is analogous to other societal safety measures we collectively accept, from water purification standards to traffic laws, all designed to prevent harm and ensure communal well-being. The overwhelming evidence supports the immense collective benefit of high vaccination rates, most critically in shielding our vulnerable populations, the elderly, the immunocompromised, and infants, from devastating diseases. This is a matter of communal responsibility. I urge that our decisions on this critical issue be guided by robust scientific evidence, by a commitment to evidence-based policy, and by a profound sense of shared responsibility to prevent suffering and save lives. The greater good sometimes requires us to accept measures that protect us all.
To conclude, while the intentions behind mandatory vaccination may be rooted in a desire for public safety, the method itself poses an unacceptable and dangerous threat to individual freedom, bodily integrity, and the fundamental principle of informed consent. These are not trivial concerns. They are the bedrock of a just and free society. We must be exceedingly cautious about the precedent set when governments assume the authority to coerce citizens into undergoing medical interventions. The potential for such power to be misused or expanded is a risk we cannot afford to ignore. My final appeal is for us to vigorously uphold our cherished liberties and to explore and invest in public health strategies that are voluntary, educational, and built on trust. Respecting individual choice is not just an ethical imperative. It is essential for maintaining a healthy relationship between the state and its citizens.
Thank you, Dr. Kirby, and thank you, Ms. Hansen, for your articulate, thoughtful, and robust arguments on this challenging topic. Tonight's discussion has clearly underscored the profound ethical and practical tension that exists between the goals of collective health security and the safeguarding of individual autonomy and liberty. We hope this debate has provided our viewers with a deeper understanding of the multifaceted perspectives involved. We encourage everyone to continue considering these important issues. That concludes the public forum for this evening. Good night.